Hello, I'm Dr. Richard O'Connor. This is Dr. James Crichton. Both myself and Dr. Crichton worked here in Helena, and our medical careers here overlapped that of Dr. Jesse A. Marcel Jr. Jim, you're probably familiar with Jesse Marcel Jr. You knew him.
Yes, I know him very well, as a matter of fact.
Okay, and you're familiar with the story of his father having recovered these materials from a crashed UFO outside of Roswell or near Corona, New Mexico in 1947.
Yes, I'm familiar with that story.
Okay, so did you ever ask Jesse about that incident?
I didn't know about it until he did tell me about it, but I knew him for a number of years before he did.
How long did you know him before he told you about that?
I don't know for sure. I think maybe 5 years or more.
Okay, I probably knew him for 2 years, worked with him in the OR at St. Peter's Hospital frequently over those 2 years before I ever asked him about it. The only reason I asked him about it was because I saw him on a documentary about Roswell on television. So next time I saw him, I came in the operating room and asked him about it, and he told me about it. Do you think it's important that that you asked him about it rather than the fact than he first coming to you and just telling you about it?
Well, I think what happened was that he did not talk about it at first. But you know, I'm kind of an older guy. I've been around a long time. I knew him from 1974. I don't think he did talk about it then.
Yeah.
It was after that for some reason, maybe to do with his father, that they decided they would tell the story. And so
Right.
that's possibly why I didn't know to ask him about it. I'd never heard about it. I was busy with other stuff.
Yeah.
So he did tell me and 2 or 3 other guys about it one day when we were coming back from a ski trip. And I don't recall how the conversation started at that time, but that was the first I'd heard of it.
Right. Well, the point being that it's not like he was going around town, you know, bending the ear of everybody that would listen to his story. You know, he was pretty reserved about it, and my feeling about it was he was never really seeking any sort of fame or recognition or notoriety because his family had had this experience. Was that kind of?
Oh, that's absolutely the case.
Okay.
He was a very modest person. That he was. He didn't tell stories. He didn't make things up. He didn't exaggerate. He was a very reliable person. I knew this at the time that he told the story because in my specialty of family practice, I did a lot of obstetrics. I did a lot of pediatrics. In those days, before we had the immunizations that prevent most of the ear infections, immunizations against Haemophilus and pneumococcus, I think close to a third of all pediatrics was a matter of managing middle ear infections, chronic ones. Everybody knew how to take care of the acute ones. But that's one of the reasons I had as much to do with Jesse as I did, because I ran into quite a few of these children that ended up having to have a tonsillectomy and or myringotomy tubes, which is a tube that puts a hole in the eardrum with a little plastic grommet-like thing that at the time was one of the treatments for chronic ear infections. So I got to know Jesse pretty well because of the fact that he was the main ENT go-to specialist around here. And we got to be friends after that.
So you were referring a lot of patients
Yeah.
to him for these procedures to help
That's right.
clear up those infections.
And he was very modest in his surgical approach to things too. I've known other ones since right here in this town that would operate on anybody that would hold still long enough. Well, he didn't do anything like that. In fact, he would always wait and see if another treatment might work. and he himself was slow to pick up the scalpel on patients, unless they really needed it, and then he was as quick as anybody. And it was like that in his whole demeanor and approach to everything. So,
yeah. Well, that's one of the hallmarks of a good surgeon, is that they're always willing to try every other avenue, before resorting to something more radical like that. Besides you and Jesse going on some ski trips together, did the two of you have any other personal, outside of work? Did you have any personal interactions with Jesse?
well, we did, and there's another thing that's changed quite a bit over time. As I say, I came to Helen in 1974. In fact, at that time, it was actually illegal for hospitals in Montana to employ physicians, which is probably relevant to how physicians treated and interacted with each other at the time, because we were all in private practice and there was nobody who was a hospital employee at that time. So we had a medical society, we knew each other's families, we did interact, and one of the interests we had was in mountaineering. And one time Jesse and Bob Stemsrud and Dawson List, they were also physicians here. The former
I knew Dawson
orthopedist,
List.
and Dawson's a pathologist. So we all went up and climbed the Grand Teton in the Teton Mountains, and that turned into quite a hoo-ha, because the weather got bad, as it can often do up there, and we were on the summit in a whiteout. And
Oh, wow.
there was a free rappel that you did, is about 150 feet, but it was in such whiteout conditions you couldn't see anything. Once you got on the rope, you better be careful, because you couldn't even see the ground.
Wow.
And then we didn't get a ride at the bottom and had to walk all the way out to where our cars were, so we walked 20 miles that day. And so an experience like that gives you a chance to see the measure of the man that you're dealing with.
Right.
Plus, we did a lot of regular skiing. In those days, you could do a lot of deep powder skiing at Bridger Bowl, which is where we went most of the time. He was a good skier, good outdoorsman, and all of that. He was exceptionally competent person, and like I say, never exaggerated, never made up stuff. Always dealt with reality in a very predictable manner, I would say.
Yeah, well, I had the same experience with Jesse. Not the climbing, of course, which sounds like it was quite a remarkable experience. But, all of my interactions with him were just as you described, just straight up, no exaggeration. I'm just absolutely confident that anything that Jesse Marcel ever said to me was as he believed it was so. I would certainly not choose a climbing partner to do something like that I didn't have full confidence in was a reliable individual. And I'm sure that you wouldn't either.
That's true.
Yeah. Now you've said that you don't really have a solid belief one way or another that Jesse's story is true, other than you believe Jesse believed it was true.
That's absolutely the case. There's no doubt in my mind that he knew it was true.
Right.
But then, one of the things I did in pre-med, I didn't study many useful subjects in pre-med. It was mostly a matter of beating you up, it seemed to me. But I did take a year of philosophy, and one of the things I got from that was the idea of epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy that helps a person try to understand that when presented with an idea, you have to have a way to try to decide if it's true or not. So epistemology is all about, well, what do we know and how do we know it, and what's true and how do you tell the difference? And that was something that I gained from my philosophy that I think was helpful whenever. And
Yeah.
in fact, a physician always has to try to, I think in my day it was more true than it is now, that you had to get most of your information about the patient from a history. You didn't just do an MRI scan right off the bat. You had to find out what happened to the person and try to judge how true it was. And so it was part of what I did for a living, was try to figure out whether people were telling me the truth or not.
Right.
And so,
As a physician, you have to make that determination
Yes.
sometimes. Yeah. So, you'd think that here we are in the year 2022. It's now 75 years after this Roswell event that Jesse told us both about, told the world about, really. You would think by now we would know for a fact whether Jesse's story that he told was true or whether it's false. Why do you think that we don't know yet whether Jesse's story was true or it was false?
well, I'm not one to ascribe to conspiracy theories, but maybe there are conspiracies. Jesse told me once, he told me this story in the dressing room of the operating room where we would occasionally be together, and he said that he'd been called to Washington, D.C., and I think it was the FBI, I'm not certain. But they interviewed him then, and they wanted to know everything that he knew and why he thought the government was covering this up. Well, of course he didn't know why the government is covering this up, and he wouldn't tell them either. So he didn't know, and I don't know. But I think that maybe it's become a habit. Who would want to be the government bureaucrat that said, oh yeah, we've been keeping this secret from you for 70 years, but I guess I'll tell you today. I don't think that's too likely. I think there are quite a few plausible reasons why that could be the case, but I don't actually know.
Yeah. Well, I don't think any of us know, but certainly over the past 5 years, there's been a lot of revelations that have come about relative to UFOs. These 3 videos that we've been able to see. We've heard interviews with the pilots that were flying missions that were sent out to intercept these UFOs off the USS Nimitz and off of the USS Roosevelt. And we've heard from one of the radar officers on the USS Princeton, a man named Kevin Day, who claimed that he saw on his radar screen an entire fleet of these UFOs that were coming in from above. The radar picked them up at an altitude of 80,000 feet, and they tracked them down to an altitude of 20,000 feet above sea level. And Kevin Day says that took about 0.75 seconds to accomplish that distance. And if you do the calculations, that velocity calculates out to be 54,528 miles per hour. So, I certainly don't think that we have any kind of vehicles that can do that sort of a performance and come to a dead stop without just squishing a pilot inside. So we've heard from men like Luis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon, who both worked within the government, within the Pentagon. Luis Elizondo ran the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the program that was studying UFOs. We've heard that from a man named Richard Doty, who worked for 8 years within the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, that he is 100% certain that the Roswell event took place, that a UFO was recovered, and that even, he claims, a live alien body was recovered as well, that was taken to Nellis Air Force Base and lived there for a period of 5 years. Have you heard, Jim, any of these allegations or any mention at all about UFOs coming from our representatives in Congress that have been informing either you or I about these incidents?
Nope. And I would say they don't do that sort of thing.
Yeah, they don't, do they?
No.
So, being, living here, being registered voters in Montana, our representatives in the Senate are Steve Daines and John Tester, and our representative in the House is Matt Rosendale. Do you think that they know anything more about these events than you or I do?
I have my doubts.
So do I. I have my doubts also.
Well, I don't know very much about a lot of things.
Okay, fair enough. So every single one of these persons that I've mentioned, and many others that have claimed to be in the know about UFOs as a result of their work in the Pentagon, has also stated plainly that these things could be a threat to our national security. If that is so, don't you think that our members, our representatives in Congress, should know something about this?
Well, in that sense, yes. However, as far as we know, they haven't heard us any yet. So, and if so, I think they could. So perhaps they're not a threat.
Right. But I would agree with that. Perhaps they're not a threat. I have not seen any evidence presented that makes me think they are a threat. They've established at least a 75-year track record of apparently not being a threat, other than perhaps these stories that we're hearing from several different previous military officers who've talked about them disabling or shutting down, switching off U.S. nuclear weapons. Whether that's a threat or a favor, I think is debatable. So the last time there were any congressional hearings about any of this was in 1968. Do you think that now that we've gotten some of this information, and based on what Jesse told us, that seems to be corroborated with this new information that we're getting, do you think that it's time that we have congressional hearings about this once again?
I absolutely think so. I agree with that 100%.
Great. Well, I do too. And I think also, in my opinion, that those open, unclassified congressional hearings should be accompanied by a time-limited offer of judicial amnesty to any whistleblower that is willing to come forward and talk about what they know from the Department of Defense, from the Department of National Intelligence, or even from private industry. Because, most of these people that inherited this problem from their predecessors, they weren't the people that made the original decision to keep all of this quiet and to keep all of this from the American people. They just sort of came in on it, went along with the program, and here we are today with our representatives in Congress knowing basically nothing more than you and I know about this very important subject. So, based on all that, that's what I'd like to call for, and that's what you've said that you'd like to see, is open, unclassified congressional hearings to try to get to the bottom of what is known by who about the UFO phenomenon for several reasons. But number one is these things may have an energy source that we could benefit from. How do they make the enormous amounts of energy that it was required to go 54,000 miles per hour and then stop on a dime? How do they do that? And is that a technology that we can use to maybe substitute for fossil fuels for energy? And if global climate change is real, which I believe is real, I know we all have our different opinions on that, but could we use that to help ameliorate global climate change if it is real and if it is due to these fossil fuels that we're using certainly in large quantities? And then the second thing is, of course, this issue about nuclear weapons. If they are shutting off our nuclear weapons, we should know that. Every American should be aware of that, and there should be a national debate about why that's happening. I guess basically I just want to finish up here by presenting an appeal to our fellow citizens. You know, write to your congressman and tell them that you would like to see open congressional hearings that are unclassified, accompanied by a time-limited guarantee of judicial amnesty for anyone that will come forward and testify about this. Jim and I felt that, you know, sitting down together and doing this, because we both personally knew Jesse Marcel, we were both convinced that he was not a liar, that he believed what he was telling us was true. Do you have anything that you want to add to this?
No, I
Jim?
don't really have anything to add to that. I think, just to summarize, I think that Jesse was absolutely credible, and it appears that as time passes, we see little dribs and drabs of information that suggests that, yes, there is another life form that has technologies that we don't have, and we should acknowledge that. And it's like any other form of knowledge, try to gain that knowledge for ourselves if we can.
Great. I agree. Well, thanks, Jim, a lot for coming over here and doing this with me. And I think maybe it'll help. I don't know if it'll help, but
Well,
this is what we can do as citizens to try to help move this forward, isn't it?
yes, it is. I think we should.
All right. Very good. Thanks for everybody for taking the time to watch this video, and please send a letter to your representatives in Congress.